Okay, everyone got their notebooks ready? Lots of information today. We won't have class on Monday because it's President's Day. We're off school. And we're going to have two things due this week. One is going to be the built version of the Gravity Goal game, like we talked about on Monday. So building that game, publishing it online, and play testing it with everybody else's games. The other thread we need to start exploring is that in order to build 3D games, we want to be able to make some three-dimensional meshes, three-dimensional assets. And so we're going to be using Cinema 4D for that. Everyone has Cinema 4D installed. And I'm going to give you my introduction here, and then also I'll have you guys watch the introduction to Cinema 4D from their most recent Maxon training, which I think is well done. And so here I'm going to be using the most recent version of Cinema, thankfully. This is 2023. In order to install Cinema 4D, you need to use the Maxon app. And if you took one of my classes previously, like last semester, and you were using Cinema 4D, you probably have Cinema 4D 26 installed. So it's a little bit confusing right now in that they just switched from going by sequential numbers. You know, it was like 24, then 25, then 26, so on and so forth, like you would expect with software. And they just switched. 26 was the last sequentially numbered one, and now the next one, and from this point going forward, they're going to use calendar naming, and so 2023 is the version that comes after 26. And so if you have 26 at home, go ahead and go to your Maxon app and update. It'll be installing the new version. So with Cinema 4D, you can have multiple versions installed at the same time, just like you can with Unity. The interface has changed maybe just slightly between 26 and 2023, but we want to be on 2023. That'll make sure that your screen looks probably the most similar to mine that's right now. Great. I think we're pretty good here. The basic idea, let's look at this, right, is that we're going to be using Cinema 4D, which is part of Maxon 1. And in here we're going to be creating three-dimensional shapes called a mesh. And the mesh, building different shapes of different things that we want in the game. And then those get exported from Cinema and then imported into Unity to use as an asset. Unity itself, sort of as commonly configured, doesn't really have any modeling tools in it. It's just for putting together the interactivity and the animation in the game. And so the actual shapes, the meshes, need to be created in some other program. The word to key on here is mesh. A mesh is going to be the equivalent, of like you can think of it like we've been using sprites. It's going to be a 3D sprite, right? Where it's going to be the basic visual element in the game. Everything that certainly appears in the three-dimensional space will be a mesh. We'll come back to that. That's all on the Miro. Great. Okay, so let's talk about a few things here in Cinema 4D. I'm going to go ahead and let's just do the tour of the interface first. We, on the left-hand side here, we have, there we go. Oh my gosh. Stop this. There we go. On the left-hand side, we have modes. Sorry, tools. Tools. All the tools are over here. This menu will change depending on what mode you're in. So the interface tries to show you the tools that would be most useful based on the current mode. Over here on the top, we have modes, right? What is it that we are manipulating? The options, the most important options are the ones right here. And those, what do we put in my notes, is that we have the one that's selected now, the blue one, is the object. And every object in 3D is made of points, edges, and polygons. That's what we see right here. Right? So right now we are in object mode. This is point mode, this is edge mode, and this is polygon mode. Another mode to be aware of is this one here. This is the axis or anchor point mode. Over here, we have a menu of commonly used objects, right? So these are going to be the things that actually make up the scene. One of the things I like about Cinema 4D is that the color coding is meaningful, and so the blue objects are some of the basic shape building blocks. Those are called primitives. A primitive, simple shape. The green objects are going to be generators, and so they generate more complex shapes based on maybe other objects or other parameters. And then for right now, the purple objects are deformers or effectors. They change something about either a blue or a green object. Over here, this is the object menu. This is going to be, the things in the scene. In general, we're not putting together a whole scene in Cinema 4D. We're kind of making individual things, and then, we lay them out in Unity, right? So we're not going to make a whole level in Cinema 4D. We're going to make the parts that make up the level. It makes more sense to arrange the level in Unity because it's more flexible, right? If we're in Unity at that point, we don't have to go back and forth more. We can lay it out and change things more quickly versus if we laid the whole thing out here. And so we're making the parts that go into the level here, right? The rocks, the trees, the characters, whatever it is that's in there. Down here, we have the attributes window. This tells you something about whatever is currently selected. This changes depending on what you currently have selected. So if you have a tool selected, it shows you the different parts for the tool. If you have an object selected, it shows you the different options for the object. And here we have our three-dimensional space, and just like in Unity, we have our three axes, and green is going to be which axis? Y. And then blue, Z, and red, there you go, got it. Right? It's like that in all the programs, so you don't need to remember it. The thing that does change from program to program is sort of like what direction those things are facing, but Unity and C4D are aligned in that way, but not every program is. Cool. The other cool thing is that the navigation is the same. So Alt left button, let me put something in the scene. I'm going to come over here to the primitive menu right there. Any button, this is just like After Effects, any button that has this tiny little tab at the bottom right hand corner, this is also a menu. So if you click and hold it, it shows you more options. And so I'll put one of these in there, sort of a placeholder figure thing. And so Alt and left mouse is orbit. It orbits around where the mouse was when it was clicked. And then the scroll wheel, if you just scroll, zooms in and out, although it zooms a fairly limited distance while with the default settings. Alt, and if pressing down the scroll wheel, moves the camera, right? This is just like Unity. And then Alt and right button, it allows you to really zoom in and out. And so manipulating and looking at things in 3D space here is very similar to using the scene view in Unity. And we get a similar looking axis or gizmo here where we can move things around by selecting a different axis and moving it around. Let's say this happens often, where you actually zoom out too far and you can't see where things are. The shortcut to get back to a regular size is H, which is a good one to think of as help, I can't see anything. So that helps if you zoom way out and you're in the cosmos, or if you zoom way into the quantum realm and you can't see anything, H will zoom back out to some sort of reasonable person size, right? So I have figures selected, press H, boom, there we go. It reorients the camera so you can see what you're doing. Great. By default right now, I'm in the Move tool in the Object mode. Right? So these two areas, that's why I introduced them back to back, the tools and the modes go together. Right? Allow me to demonstrate. So let's get a simpler shape, this cube. The cube here, I am going to do that for a second. And I'm in the Move tool right here, right? And so these are also similar to Unity. ERT, let's write those down. E is going to be the shortcut for the move. R is going to be rotate. And T is going to be scale. So this is usually where my hands are when I'm using C4D, right? On the mouse, and then left hand on ERT. Those are the tools you're using most of the time to, just do basic manipulation in the scene. And you can see over here, as I press those buttons, I'm cycling through the tools. It tells me what the tool is right here. And you see that the axis changes, right? So move has the arrows. Rotate has the gyroscope circles, and scale has the cubes, the blocks on the end. And so these are the tools. I'm still in object mode. And so if I move, I'm moving an object. If I rotate, I'm rotating the entire object. And just Control-Zing back. If I scale, I'm scaling the entire object. These tools could be applied to any of these modes. If I go to polygon mode and click on a single polygon that's part of the cube, now if I press E, I'm moving the polygon, not the object, one of the polygons. If I R for rotate, I'm rotating the polygon, not the object. And if I scale, again, I'm manipulating the polygon. Okay. Edge mode, same deal, right? So I'm able to move an edge, rotating an edge. Now we start to get into a situation where these are kind of mathematical calculations. They don't actually have any size in terms of the edge and the point. So if I rotate this way, it doesn't really do anything, right? If you think about it, that's kind of just where the axis of the edge goes. If I can rotate this way, that obviously does something. And I could rotate this way, that does something. And then scaling here, similar situation. You can scale here, scaling this way, or this way doesn't really do anything, right? So scaling along the length of the edge makes sense. And then I can go to point mode, right? So all I'm doing is going between the different modes up here and the move, scale, and rotate tools. So with points, again, these are sort of mathematical representations. They don't actually have any size. The point does. And so, for instance, scaling a point doesn't do anything. Doesn't make any sense. It's like this infinitely small point in space. It has no size. And so 0 times anything is 0, right? Same deal. Rotating a point doesn't do anything. It's a point. It doesn't really have a direction. And then, but moving a point does. That makes sense, right? I can move the point around there, right? So I was able to, take this cube and, radically change its shape by, using the different objects in using the different modes and the different tools. If I go back to object mode, now when I move, rotate, and scale, I'm doing it to the manipulated shape, the shape that I transformed by going in and using those tools with other modes. The other mode to be aware of that we will need to learn about here is this one. This is the anchor point or axis mode. If I go into this one, now I can move the anchor point of the object. This is important, right? It's like what we did in Unity with the sprites in the sprite editor, where we moved the anchor point, because the location of the anchor point is going to be important for if I come out of anchor point mode. Okay, so anchor point mode is like a toggle. A toggle is a light switch, right? So it's either on or off, one of those two states. Right now it's on. And so if I'm moving, I'm not moving the object, I'm moving the anchor point for the object. If I toggle this off and now go back to rotate, I rotate from over there versus before when I was rotating from the middle of the object. This makes a difference for rotation and for scaling, right? You scale from the anchor point. If I were to move the anchor point over here and turn that off and go back to rotation, and now I'm rotating from over there. And I can also scale from over there, right? So this allows me to change. One of the most common mistakes students make here at the beginning is that they turn anchor point on, the mode, and then they forget that it's on, and they're like, why doesn't my move tool work? I go into the move tool and I can't move the object. You can't move the object because you are in object anchor point mode, okay? So you need to turn that off, then you can once again manipulate the object. And yeah, these objects, they're just individual polys and points. They can overlap each other. right? We've done a little bit of the physics work in Unity, but we had to tell Unity that this object has physics, right? Have it run into other things. The same system is going to be used in 3D, and by default, none of that is at play here in Cinema 4D. It's just, they're just shapes in space that can overlap each other or intersect each other with no real consequences. Cool. Okay. That's good. Let's go ahead and delete that for now. Let's come over here and some other shortcut. If you haven't got a mouse yet, use it. Using all of these programs, trying to do it with a trackpad is, just not great. And so being able to use the mouse makes this all much easier. Up here, this is a important toggle. It goes between 1 view and 4 views. So just these views also exist in Unity, and the thing you need to write down in your notes and memorize is over here. We have the perspective view, where it looks like how we experience the world, right? How our basic experience works. Over here, in the other 4 views, this one, and this one, these are referred to as orthographic. We ran into this with the Unity camera, right, when we talked about using the 2-dimensional view. The big difference here, perspective is how we experience the world. Orthographic is more like a blueprint. Objects in the distance are not smaller. This allows us to, it's a direct slice of space. It's a perfect 2-dimensional slice of space with no convergence or vanishing point from each of these 3 directions, from the top, from the front, and then from the side. That's what the perspective views are. So allow me to demonstrate. And let's learn another really great Cinema 4D shortcut. Control drag equals, I'll get it, copy drag. I use this a lot. So I'm going to hold down Control, then click on the Z-axis and drag. This is not dragging the first person, it drags a duplicate of that person. And I have to let go of the mouse first, then Control, in order to actually make the copy. And so check it out, we get 2 objects and obviously 2 objects over here. And I'm going to take this one and move it over a little bit to the side. And in the perspective view, things operate as we would imagine. The person that's further away from us in distance is smaller, right, compared to the person that is in the foreground. Perspective view. If we look at the orthographic view, this is the front orthographic view of this same scene. These 2 models are exactly the same size. I didn't scale them at all. And we can easily tell that here in the orthographic view, right? Because there is no diminishing along the Z-axis in the front view. It's a sort of perfect slice of the Y and the Z. Does that make sense? Cool. So the orthographic views, while they may seem unnecessarily obtuse here at the beginning, they are great for precise location. It's much easier to precisely place things in space using the orthographic views than it is with the 3D view. Part of that is that the 3D is all just an illusion. The monitor is not 3D, right? The monitor is 2D. It's flat, right? There's nothing actually coming out of the monitor. So there's this unavoidable compromise there, right? We make things look three-dimensional through perspective and vanishing lines and so on and so forth. But it's not actually 3D. Also, keep this in mind, the mouse, right? The mouse only has 2 dimensions of manipulation, right? You can either move the mouse this way or you can move the mouse this way. You can't doing this with the mouse doesn't do anything, right? The computer doesn't understand that, right? There's other tools that you can use that can bring that into play, but just, you know, the standard situation here is that we have a 2-dimensional thing that we're using to manipulate objects in 3D space, and so there's this innate tension between those two things. The other shortcut here is press the scroll wheel to make the view full screen. I might have a separate page of my notes where I'm writing down just a list of shortcuts. So if I'm over this window and I press the scroll wheel, that one becomes full screen. If I press the scroll wheel again, it goes back to the 4 views. If I come over here and press the scroll wheel when my mouse is over this part of the screen, boom, that's full screen now. If I press it again, that goes out, right? So I'm able to look at one at a time if I wanted to by doing that, right? If you need to, it's also this button right there. But usually I'm just pressing the scroll wheel to get back and forth between these different views. To look at one at a time. Cool. A bunch of shortcuts in Cinema 4D are 2-stage, meaning that you sort of press one key to set up a bunch of options, and then you press a second key to select. Okay. The first one of these you want to learn is NA and then NB. What does this do? This turns on and off the polygon view. So NA is the default, where we don't see the underlying polygons. N, and then, so N brings up the, essentially the view menu, and then if you look, B is Gouraud shading with lines, and that shows us the underlying structure of the object, and this makes it pretty clear why these objects are called meshes, right? They're shapes, they're defined by polygons along the outside of the shape. And the word you need to memorize and learn for this is that the layout of the polygons on the surface of the object is called the topology of the object. Right, this is the layout of the polygons. So pressing NB reveals the topology of the object. We kind of want to be looking at it this way all the time, right? Because we're going to be making things here, and the topology for the shape matters quite a bit when you go to manipulate the shape. And so we really want to be seeing the topology of the object at all times. Cool. So now, let's, I'm going to hold this down and make a sphere. There we go. So we have a sphere, and this allows me to say something else about topology here, is that, the layout of the polygons is the topology, the density of these is the topology, and I think this is the most clear example of a fundamental principle. Right? So when I talk about principles, I'm a big proponent of first principles thinking. This is really what I have in mind when I'm doing this kind of work. I have a small number of principles that guide my decision making, and from those principles I can derive what it is I need to do or how I can possibly go about solving a problem. And one of the principles here for 3D modeling is that a polygon cannot be bent. Okay? So you see that it's made up, this sphere is made up of individual polygons. It does look like the surface of it is bent, but the bending of the surface is a result of the angle of the polygon changing when it meets another polygon at an edge. The polygon itself, this surface here, this face, is perfectly flat, okay? And it can't be bent. It's the way this works when you're doing this kind of work. And so if I came in here and made a plane of some kind, I'm going to make the plane just a single polygon, this would be flat and unable to be bent. It could be distorted, right? So I have, this is what we're looking at right here. This is a single polygon, okay, just one, right? So this type of polygon, I would write it down in my notes. This is our favorite type of polygon. There's different types of polygon. This one is a quad because it's got 4 sides, right? It's got 4 sides, so these are referred to as quads. And they're the best for a variety of reasons that we'll discuss later on. They just translate better to being manipulated by different objects. If I went into point mode here and started manipulating this, I could, move this point off of this plane by doing this. But I'm not actually bending this object, right? It doesn't look like it's curved at all. And in general, doing something like this, where we take a quad and make it non-planar, right? Non-planar meaning that we can no longer pass a plane through all 4 points. This is generally not a good idea. Not a good way to manipulate the geometry. And so a single polygon cannot be bent. And so how do we bend things? We create, smoothness or bending by subdividing and then changing the angle for each subdivision. So, for instance, I'm going to make a cube. There we go. And I'm going to come down here and introduce one of the purple ones. Purple ones, remember, are called deformers. And if I make a purple one here, that's the other nice thing about Cinema 4D is the icons, they've done, in my opinion, one of the best jobs in icon design. In that, the icon usually is pretty representative of what the thing does, right? And so this is the bend deformer. It's got a thing bending. And so if I were to put the bend deformer, I have to make it a child of the cube. We'll get to this in a second. Just follow along here. I'm sort of making a different point. We'll get to this technical part in a second. And so I've got a bend. And what does the bend do here? It bends the geometry that is inside of it. Okay? This is not a deformer I use often, but it's good for making this point. And if you look at the yellow box that's bending here, it looks like it's being bent, right? We get a curved shape along the bend. But look at the underlying topology of the cube, the thing that's actually being manipulated, right? The purple, the yellow thing is not actually there. It's just an interface for the tool. The cube itself is not bending. Rather, it's kind of just stretching, right? Why is it not actually creating a curve there? Because this is just one polygon. And a single polygon cannot be bent. So in order to actually create curvature, we need to subdivide. So I'll come over to the cube, I'll select that, I'll go to the Object tab, and if I start to give this cube more subdivisions, now it starts to appear bent. And the number of subdivisions dramatically affects the smoothness of the bend. Everybody with me there? All right, so less subdivisions gives me a more blocky sort of look. It's still kind of following the shape, but not really. If I were to give it even more subdivisions, now it's very, very smooth, right? So why not just make everything many, many polygons? That way it will look smooth. This is another principle, is, less polygons will be processed faster than more polygons. Now, you don't need to go crazy about this at the beginning. Most of what we do here at the beginning, we don't need to really get into the weeds in terms of optimization. The reality is that the computers are fast enough now that we don't need to be worrying about optimization in these sort of beginning learning contexts. Things will run fairly well. But as you go forward, every polygon that's on the screen increases the amount of calculations the computer needs to do, in Cinema 4D or in Unity, right? A polygon on the screen means that a bunch of things need to be calculated. Those points in space, how light hits this part of it, the angle of it, so on and so forth. And so having less of those is faster than having more of those, but you want enough to be able to accurately represent whatever shape it is that you're making. Cool. Let's come back here. I'll make another sphere to sort of demonstrate the same thing, right? So this is the default setting for the sphere. And if I select the sphere here, and the attributes menu, as soon as I select the sphere, shows me all of the sphere attributes. The attributes menu is divided into like a sub-menu of tabs. The basic tab is something we don't really need to manipulate much here for this class or in the beginning. This is kind of like, is this object on? Can I see it? These kind of things. Not super important for the work we need to do. The coordinates tab tells you where the object is. This is its position in space from the origin. This is the rotation of the object along the x, y, and z axes. And then this is the scale of the object, right? So this should look familiar, right? We also have this in Unity, right? When you have any object there, this is just basic transform properties. They're also called transform properties in Unity. It's just, where is this thing? And these are the basic things you need to know about it in order to position something in three-dimensional space. The tab that is probably most important for us is this one, the Object tab. And if I click on Object, now I get some stuff here that should probably make a little sense, just like out of the box, right? I have a sphere, and so I have a radius parameter. Like, how big is this thing? Radius being the distance from the center out to the edge. And then segments. And so segments here, we can tell that this is a sphere, but it's not the world's smoothest sphere, right? For reasons that we just discussed, because you can't bend these polygons. I can make it look like a smoother sphere by increasing the segments and the subdivision, right? And so part of, how smooth does my object need to be? Does it need to be, this smooth or this smooth? The answer to that has to do a lot with the scale of the object in the scene. You've probably all experienced this when you've played video games. There's different ways that this is manifest, but things that are really big or are going to need way more detail than the things that are very small. And sort of along this, if we're going to get close to an object, it's going to need more detail, it's going to need more polygons. If the object is always very far away, it can have a much less dense, a much more sparse topology, right? Because if we're looking at this sphere from back here, does it look round enough? Yeah, right? If this was like, a game and this was like the golf ball in the game, or the size of a golf ball, yeah, that's plenty, right? That's no problem. If this is going to be some sort of giant sphere that takes up the entire screen, then this is probably not enough roundness. It would need to be subdivided further to create something that looks sufficiently round. So a lot of this depends on the scale of the thing that you're trying to make. And let me draw your attention to this. Right, this comes from this menu right here. This menu, once again, these are all referred to as primitive shapes, right? Sort of the basic 3D, simple shapes. But like I said before, the shape itself is a separate issue from the way that the polygons are laid out on that shape. And so under here, under type, if you were to change this, you can see that there are, there we go, different ways to reorganize the topology along the surface of a sphere, right? So that's a tetrahedron, a hexahedron, an octahedron, an icosahedron, right? The icosahedron, this is all equally sized triangles. The octahedron, which one am I looking for? Yeah. Hexahedron. The hexahedron is different. These are all quads, and you notice it doesn't have a polar pattern to the way that the topology is laid out. The standard one here, we get this very clear North Pole and South Pole setup, where the lines, are laid out as you would expect, like on a globe. We have latitude and longitude here. Which one should you use? It depends, right? What kind of shape you're going to make and how this sphere might be manipulated later on, because the topology matters, right? This is another, in my 285 class in the mornings, I've been saying this pretty much every day all semester long. We've been using it in reference to simulations, but it goes for pretty much every part of 3D modeling. Topology matters. How the polygons are laid out on the surface of the object is going to make it easier or more difficult to change the shape. So thinking about the topology as you're working on making the object is incredibly important. Cool. Let's come over here to the sphere. Right now, you notice that it has an icon that looks like a sphere. That makes sense. One of the most important Cinema 4D shortcuts, C. Okay, just hitting C, not Control C or Shift C or anything. just C. What does C do? It converts from an object to a polygonal object. I meant to put a arrow in there. What does this mean? When it's an object, I refer to these as procedural objects. Procedural objects are built with instructions, an algorithm. Polygon objects are just a raw mesh. So, I've got this sphere right here. If I go to object mode, I can do all the things to the object that we talked about earlier. I can move it, I can rotate it, and I can scale it. However, I cannot manipulate the individual polygons. I switch to polygon mode, and I can't do anything here. I'm still scaling it, but I'm not scaling the polygons. I'm just scaling the entire object. Why? Because it's still a procedural object. Its shape is being generated by essentially these instructions over here. What is the radius? How many segments does it have? And what is the topology layout, right? If I were to duplicate this object by pressing E for move and then Control drag to make another one right there, and then on this other one, I'm going to select it and I'm going to press C. Now, as soon as I press C, let me draw your attention to two things. I am in polygon mode, and how do I know I hit C on this one? Because the icon has changed. See how the icon changed? This is Cinema 4D helping you out here. This one is a sphere. It's being drawn by the sphere algorithm. This one is a mesh. I hit C and converted it into a polygonal mesh. It still has the name sphere, but that's irrelevant. I could type any name in there I want. I could call it Bob. It doesn't matter. It's just whatever the name is for that object. But the icon has changed, and now it's made up, and I have access to the points, edges, and polygons, right? And so if I select Bob and grab polygon mode, now I can manipulate the individual polygons in this object. I can do stuff like this, or rotate one, or grab a point and move this point, creating like sort of a spike there, or whatever it is I would want to do. Okay? In your notes, when you hit C to convert, one-way trip. Once you hit C to convert it into a polygonal object, now it's a polygonal object. You cannot revert to being a sphere. It's not like a limitation of the program. It's a conceptual limitation, right? It's no longer a sphere. I've changed and manipulated the polygons, and so this is no longer a sphere. It doesn't have a radius anymore, right? It's now just a collection of individual points that can be manipulated in some way. If I come over here to the selection tool, if I go to polygon mode, this allows me to drag and select more than one polygon at a time, which I could move all together. Right? And it's no longer a sphere. I can't go back to the sphere. And so a lot of times the way this works is that you start with a primitive shape to sort of get your foot in the door, right? If I asked you to model a basketball, right? You're going to start with a sphere, right? You probably hit C to manipulate it at some point, but it makes sense to start with that. So you start with a primitive, you hit C, and then manipulate the shape. And so the primitives aren't usually the end of the process. They're just the beginning. Like, let me get this whole thing rolling, right? If I ask you to make a suitcase, right, you'll probably start with a cube, right, and get the cube roughly to the size of a suitcase, and then go from there, after manipulating some of the polygons in the cube. Okay, let's dive into using move, scale, and rotate a little bit more. We'll just use move here as a good way to set things up. So when we're moving something in 3D space, again, one of my principles here is that it's a 2D interface, right? And we're using this two-dimensional input system, a mouse. And so one of the tactics I've extrapolated from that is that only move in 2 dimensions at a time, not all 3. So how does that work? This is a little unintuitive at first. We have the move tool here, which is represented by the axis. If I just have the object selected and then just click and drag, if I am in the move tool in object mode, there we go, move tool, object mode. As you go back and watch Cinema 4D tutorials from me and from other people, as someone's doing the work they're doing, that's one of the important things to take note of. If it works for them but it doesn't work for you, are you in the same mode? Do you have the same tool, right? Because if you don't have those two things correctly configured, whatever it is you're trying to do may not work. So in the object move tool, if I click and drag, all 3 axes light up. They all become white. And I'm moving the object around, and I'm moving it around in 3D space right now. It's moving on the X, the Y, and the Z. If I select the object and I go to coordinates and watch this value right here, all 3 numbers are changing. This is bad. Gad. Bad. Nah. Bad. This is bad, right? We only want to use, 2 dimensions or maybe 1 dimension at a time, because it's very, very difficult to precisely locate something using a 2-dimensional tool in 3D space. How do I make sure I'm only using 1 dimension at a time? There's a couple different ways to do this. I'll show you a few. I think the easiest one is that you mouse over just 1 axis, right? And so if I just want to move it straight to the side, I would mouse over the red arrow, then click and drag. And this locks it in to that axis. So I can't move it forward and back. I can't accidentally move it up and down. It's just moving side to side. This makes it very easy for me to manipulate it. And if you watch the attributes window over here, only this menu is moving because I'm only moving it on the X. I could do the same with the Z, and I could do the same with the Y. If I wanted to move it in 2 dimensions, right? So that's our maximum. We don't want to move in 3 dimensions, we maximum 2. A lot of times, we're building things where there's a floor and there's walls, like how we usually experience space. The axis here, if you grab this little corner in between, it allows you to move it in 2 dimensions. So now I'm moving it on what's referred to as the XZ plane. If you watch the numbers, the Y number is not moving, but the X and Z are. So this is the equivalent of sliding something around on the floor in most instances by doing this, grabbing this corner right here. And so I would write that one down. The XZ plane, when you think about it conceptually, is the floor, right? XZ, that's the floor. The YZ and the YX are going to be, walls in different directions. Like, depending on how we did it in this room, this would be YZ and that would be YX. But regardless, the floor would be the XZ plane. And so I can do the same thing here or the same thing there. Another approach to this is to hold down Shift, then start clicking and dragging. And that tries to lock it to one axis. Although it is a little finicky. Like I'm trying to get it to move on the Z, and I'm going to need to essentially just change the view a little bit there. Right? So if you hold down Shift, it does lock it to that axis. Although to be honest, I'm usually just doing this and just grabbing whichever axis I usually use. But the Shift one is useful, and I know some people use that often. The other way you could precisely locate something is just by typing it in here. Say this needs to be at 500, 500. And so you could just say the X is going to be at 500, tab, the Y at 0, and then the Z at 500, enter. And notice that when something got off of screen there, let's go to 2000, there we go. When something's off screen, when I have this cube selected and I can't see it anymore, Cinema 4D gives me this hint. It's like, hey, that thing is somewhere out there. You need to look over there for it. Or I could resolve this by pressing H, and it takes me back to where that object is, wherever it is in space there. Right, so you can always precisely move things like that. One other option for precisely moving is to start dragging and hold down Shift. Right, so Shift before you start to drag will lock it to the axis. If you hold down Shift after you start to drag, it quantizes the amount of movement. And so now, if you look at how far it's moving, the default in Cinema 4D is centimeters, and now it goes from 0 to 5 to 10 to 5, 15, 20, so on and so forth. 5 centimeter increments. As opposed to if you just grab and start moving it, you see I'm getting these values, and I end up at 118.5069 centimeters, right? A lot of times, values like this, unless we're creating some sort of more organic shape, are not super useful, right? Because if you're going to need it to fit in with something else, using round numbers makes all that much easier, right? Versus like, okay, so what's 2 times 118.5069? Like, makes it much easier. Let's just call it 120, and now it's exactly 120, right? So that would make placing things a lot more simple doing that. Another thing is that when we're building things, we want to build around the origin. Remember, the origin is the center of the world. It's where x equals 0, y equals 0, z equals 0, the origin, right? You want to build things there. You don't want to build things way off in left field, right? Because remember, this is not the final destination for these things. Our things are going to be brought into Unity. And so it just makes it more complicated if you're building things way out there. It makes it much easier to think about the calculations and the math if everything's being built around the center here. That's good. So for instance, if I wanted to create something that's equally distant here, I could start dragging, hold down Shift, and you can combine these. So if I hold down Shift and Control, now I'm snapping, but I'm making a copy at a precise distance, right? So there it is I'm going to make a copy that's exactly 250 centimeters over. I could do the same thing with the other one. So hold down, start dragging, hold down Control, hold down Shift. You want to do Shift first. There we go. Then Control, and that one's 250. Let go of the button first, then the keys. And so I've got these very precisely placed there. Right? You can manipulate more than one object at a time. So if I came in here now, I could grab all three of these, and by click, 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 holding down Control or Shift to grab all three, and now I can hold down Control and Shift to make another row right there. I could go back and grab the first row, and once again make another one precisely at 250 there, right? And just by doing that, made it real easy to make, you know, this perfectly spaced grid of cubes. Now I could do, you know, grab all of them and hold down Shift and then Control. Now I got that, and grab the bottom 9 and hold down Shift and then Control. Right. And now I've got a perfectly spaced cube of cubes. Now, I've got a bunch of objects. This allows us to start talking about the objects. The object menu is organized in a hierarchy, which means you can have parents and children. Okay, this is just like Unity. Pretty much every program works like this, where we have parents and children objects, right? And so if the parent moves, the child moves. If the child moves, the parent does not. And so, time for another good shortcut for the shortcut list. Alt or Option if you're on Mac. G equals group together into a null, right? And so a null is going to be an empty axis. We've already used these in Unity. We made an empty game object, right? Which didn't have anything except for just transform. It's just a point in space around which you can organize other objects. And so here, you can see how, you know, now if this is a thing that, you know, I want to bring into my game, it probably doesn't make sense to bring it in as whatever this is, 27 objects. And so I can grab them all and then hold down Alt and G, and oh, what happened? Now we have a null, and the hierarchy in Cinema 4D can be folded and unfolded by pressing on the plus. And so right there, if I want to go back and look at any of these things, I can hit the plus, and now we can clearly see the visual hierarchy. You know, it's like when you're outlining in your notes, right? These are indented underneath the parent. And this can go on for as long as you want. You can have many, many, many levels of parent, child, parent, child relationships. And so now, if I grab the null, I can move all of the objects at the same time. I can rotate them all at the same time, and I can scale them all at the same time by grouping them together like that. Right, so I think that makes a lot of sense. Alt-G to group. Another good shortcut here that's in that family, for instance, if I moved this over there, is Alt-0 will zero out the transform. Essentially, it will return the object to the origin. So this cube of cubes, I'll rename it to CC. I moved it, and now it's at some wacky location over there. I need to get it back to the center of the world. I'll select CC, I'll press Alt-0, boom. Snaps it back to the center of the world. Super useful. This allows us to let's leave that where it is. I want to leave this, but not totally get rid of it. If we look at the object menu, allow me to explain a few things. This over here, this is a tag. Right? So everything that appears on the row here to the right of the object is a tag. Tags do a bunch of different things. They somehow change the object or give it other properties or other ways to store things. Those are all tags. The primitive objects and other objects have a green checkbox which sort of turns them on and off. Let's find one that's, there we go. Right, so here, right, so it turns this object on and off, essentially making it functional or not functional. And then these two, you'll hear people refer to them as the traffic lights in C4D tutorials, is that when these are green, you'll see the object. When they're red, you won't see the object, but because the check mark is still on, it's still functional, it's just invisible. And the top one is the one we care about. This is whether or not I can see it in the editor. This is whether or not I can see it in the renderer. We're not going to care too much about the rendering, right? Cinema 4D can render stuff. If you've taken 184, you've rendered a bunch of things in Cinema 4D. Control R shows us what the actual rendered output would look like. In general, for this class, we are not going to render in C4D. What do we care about? We're using C4D. We are not rendering in C4D, right? We're just making meshes. The meshes get sent to Unity, and that's where the rendering is happening, right? Cinema 4D is not a real-time program. You can't make a video game in Cinema 4D, right? You can make an animation, essentially output a movie that you just play from beginning to end, but you can't make it interactive, right? It doesn't have code in the same way that you're able to then have someone interact with it, right? Like we did on Monday, we turned our game into a functional Windows application, and that's not what Cinema 4D does. You can just make a movie, or you can make, you know, a mesh that then gets sent to some other program. But we're sort of running up against that in the interface here. This top one is whether or not you can see it in the editor, and the bottom one is whether or not you can see it in the render, right? So if I double-click the bottom one, so the bottom traffic light is red, I can see the cube, but now if I Control R to render, it's gone. This is useful if you're actually rendering in Cinema 4D. Like I said, we're not doing that here. The one that makes a lot more sense, the one that we're going to use more often, is this, right? Essentially disabling and enabling objects in order to build functionality that way. So, this is important. Let's use something other than cubes, just for fun. I'll grab this thing. Okay, so there we go, platonic shape. I look at this, go to object, right? Remember, object is where, most of the time, that's where the actual functionality of the object is, right? So I have radius, okay, that makes sense. Segments, okay, that makes sense. And then type. Different types of platonic shapes. I've got this shape here. I am going to Control drag it over here. And the one in the center of the world here, I'm going to rename to parent. And the one in the next level here, this will be child. And how do I make this a child? We did make one parent-child relationship by hitting Alt-G, and that grouped everything together as a child of a null. But how do I explicitly control a hierarchy? I grab the child, and while I'm holding the left mouse button down, I drag over top of the parent. And if you look, I can't zoom in on this because it doesn't work like that. If I drag while I'm over the parent, next to the mouse there's an arrow pointing down. That means when I let go, it's going to make the child a child of the parent, right? And we can see that from the hierarchy here. If I select the parent and I press R for the rotate tool, I rotate, and now the child rotates relative to the parent. Okay, this is, again, Unity works the exact same way here. If I select the child and rotate, the child rotates freely and the parent does not rotate, right? Because it's further down in the hierarchy. I could, continue this chain though, right? If I did the child, if I E, then control drag, and then T, there we go. And this will be child moon, right? Now if I click and drag, let go, I've created a 3-level hierarchy. 1, 2, 3. And so if I rotate the child, the moon rotates, but not the parent. If I grab the moon, that rotates by itself. And if I grab the parent, all of them rotate relative to the child. And you can build this, as long as you would want. Right? So if I could have a whole other subset set of things that were all a child of the moon, right? And so now you rotate this, rotate this, rotate this, rotate that, rotate this, rotate that. Right? See how now I've kind of created a chain of things by creating this kind of hierarchy. That's actually the name for a long chain like this. We'll get into this more. This is what's referred to as an FK chain, and that's forward kinematics. We'll get into this more when we talk more about rigging, but this is how limbs work, right? The upper arm is a parent of the lower arm, which is a parent of the wrist, which is a parent of the fingers. In the finger, this is a parent of the second knuckle, which is a parent of the fingertip, right? So you can have these branching chains here down. For instance, I could take this part of the chain and control drag it up under this moon, and now have a separate branching structure, right? And so now we have this chain, and then this one branches like this. And if I rotate the top, everything comes along. But if I were to rotate further down the chain, I could just manipulate one part of the chain and another part of the chain. Cool. Back here, one more thing about parents and child. The child coordinates are relative to the parent. The parent is relative to the world. Okay, so before we talked about always building things in the center of the world, 0, 0, 0. The child coordinates are going to be expressed in how far is the child from the parent. So for instance here, I'll build a similar chain. I'll control drag this over, and then I'll control drag it over again. And so this one will be child, this one will be second child, and so we'll make child underneath parent, this one will be underneath child. There we go. And so now if I look at this and go to the coordinates tab, the very top of the chain, the parent, is at 0, 0, 0. That makes sense, right? I didn't move that thing, I just created it. It created it in the middle of the world, and that's where it is. Good. If I look at the child is at x equals 250 and 0, 0. Okay, makes sense. And then if I look at this one, x equals 260. Huh, okay, well that seems confusing because this looks like about the same distance. This is 260 from here, right? This is the subchild. Its parent, the child, is 262. It's 260 along the x-axis. This distance from here to here is 250. Okay, and so that means our subchild here, how far is it from the actual center of the world? You know, like 510. 260 plus 250. If I were to move the parent, something like that, the parent's coordinates change. That makes sense. The child, these coordinates are the same because this is not its position in the world, it is its position relative to the parent. As soon as you make something the child, the parent becomes the center of the world for that object. And this is true the whole way down the chain, right? Because this is unchanged. And if I go to the second child, also unchanged, still 260 from the parent. They haven't moved at all in relationship along the z or the y, and so they're, you know, perfectly oriented in space compared to where they were before. But if I move the parent, that's where it is. So let me over here, and I'm just going to make this more visually obvious. Okay, and so we'll do that. And there we go. Don't worry about following along, I just did that for demonstration purposes. The second child here, which is red, if I were to grab this and return it to 0, remember the shortcut for that is Alt plus 0. If I grab this and say Alt 0, it's moved it to exactly where the parent is, right? Because it's zeroed out the coordinates for the child, but when you zero out the coordinates for the child, it puts it exactly where the parent is. If I were to grab the next one up the chain and press Alt 0, it collapses it again. Now essentially all three of them are in the same place, and now if I grab the parent and pressed Alt 0, it returns the whole group to the center of the world, the origin, right? So the important part here is that the child coordinates are relative to the parent. This is true in every program. After Effects, C4D, Unity, Blender. It's just basic logic, right? It's the way you have to do this in order for it to make any sort of logical sense, in order to make the math doable to express these things. So keep this in mind. In order to put something exactly where something else is, occasionally I use this trick. I've got something over here, and now I want to move my other thing to exactly this location. Well, a good sort of hack to do that is take the thing I want to move, make it a child of the other thing, and then zero it out and then take it out of the hierarchy. And now it's exactly on top of the other thing. Makes it easy to move something to exactly where the other thing is. So you can use hierarchies to easily manipulate those kind of things. Saving in Cinema 4D, File, Save Project, Control S. When you save a Cinema 4D project, you're going to be saving a C4D file. So let's just put it in the Art200 folder for right now. There we go. And I'll call this cube, and save. And that saves the file as a C4D file, right? And so that's something I can go back and open up later and manipulate. And if you have Cinema 4D installed, it should show up as, you know, the Cinema 4D icon, and it should say it's a C4D file in the file browser. That's good. But like I said, this is not what we bring into Unity. Why not? That would seem to be the easiest. Because, you know, reasons, I suppose, you know, business. There's many different 3D formats, and in order to have the maximum flexibility within Cinema 4D, Unity is going to want different things out of their files. So we need to convert. It's not that big a deal. So for instance, here with CC, up here under Objects, we have a easy to use export option. And so if I select this, File, Export Selected Object As, and that allows us to select what we want right here, which is FBX, right? And so that's going to give us what we want. When you work and you make a 3D thing, you're going to want to save the C4D file so that later you can go back and make changes if you need to. And once you're ready to bring it to Unity, you export it to an FBX file, because that's the thing that comes into Unity. Okay? But you don't want to skip this step, because if you just export the FBX file and call it a day, there's going to, if you need to go back and make changes, there's a bunch of things that you won't be able to adjust in the FBX file that you can adjust if you still have the C4D file, right? This is like using Illustrator, right? When you use Illustrator, it's a vector, and you can save the Illustrator file, right? But often, when you need to print it, you need to export it as a PNG. And so it's the same sort of thing. You don't want to just export the PNG, you want to also save the original Illustrator file so that you can go back and adjust the vector graphics if you need to later. Okay, and so we will File, Export Selected Object as FBX, and in here, a few things. We get a menu. Fortunately, there's not too many changes we need to make. The most important thing is right here. Write this down. Turn off camera and lights on export. Let's take a picture of that. Let's put it in our notes. Okay, so when we're exporting, we have some other steps to our export protocol that we'll get into. We don't need to get into that nitty-gritty right now, but this last one turn off cameras and lights. This is critical, right? Otherwise, if you bring it into Unity, you'll be bringing in extra cameras, which is just ends up being a pain in the butt. It's not unsolvable, but it's irritating. And so I'm going to uncheck lights, uncheck cameras. Once you do this the first time, they should stay unchecked when you go to export the next time. So you just need to remember the first time. And I can say OK, and it asks me where to put it. And we'll call this again cube. But it's not going to override our C4D file because we're not making it a C4D file. We're making an FBX file. And then let's come back over here. I'm going to make just a new scene just to test this stuff out. There we go. We'll go 3D test and open that scene. Great. And so now, how do I get the FBX file in here? I can just drag it into the assets. Right. So if you're on Windows, this should look like a Unity thing, and this should look like C4D. And so we want the 3D object. You can just drag that in here, and it comes up as this cube, and I should be able to just drag it into my view. And now I've got it here in Unity. It's a 3D thing that I can see in my game and place in my game. And like we did when we were having fun before, if we have a material of any kind now, like all the material work we're going to need to do, I'm not really going to spend any time talking about that in Cinema because it makes more sense to apply the materials here in Unity because they'd be easier to manipulate. And so now I can drag this onto there. Actually, this is a good example. If you look at it does have a little arrow next to it. And so it's a good thing to write down, the hierarchy from C4D transfers to Unity. You can see that right here. If I were to unfurl this arrow, boom. All of those cubes that I grouped together are still there. So I exported the whole thing. I have the entire hierarchy, which is why I couldn't drag my material onto the top level. Why not? Because the top level is not a thing. Remember, the top level is just a null, just a blank game object. If I drag the red onto a cube, I can do that, right? And if I had other materials, now I could drag these on as I see fit here. And since they're all individual objects, they could all be animated and or manipulated separately in Unity, using the same tools. And the same rules apply in most of these instances. If I go up and grab the top, same thing. I'm able to manipulate the whole group while still maintaining the other instances of that here. Does a pipeline make sense? Right. So pipeline is going to be the workflow from program to program. Wouldn't it be really great if one program just did anything? Yeah, it would be, but I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get there, right? Why? Because wouldn't it be great if the program did a bunch of things, right? That second statement is at odds with the first statement. Whereas, like, wouldn't it be great if we had one program, right? The balance there is such that in order for one program to be more fully featured, you have to expand in one direction and not another direction. And so, in some, in visual effects companies and in big game studios, this is an entire job. Where people would be using 3 or 4 different programs, and a technical artist would be, or a pipeline manager would be the person, figuring out how to best change the data so that it most easily moves from one program to another program without losing a bunch of fidelity along the way, right? But our pipeline in this instance stays fairly simple. It goes from C4D, and then it becomes an FBX, and then it gets put into Unity, right? Later in the semester, we'll expand our pipeline slightly, so that we'll make a mesh in C4D, and then we'll send it to, I can't use tab, we'll send it to Substance Painter, and then we'll send it to Unity, because we can do a lot of interesting things to the surface there fairly easily. Cool, let's come back over here. Something else in Unity to turn on here, go to Edit Preferences and go to Files and make sure your autosave is enabled so that Cinema 4D is saving copies of the project every 5 minutes. It'll only save a maximum of 10 copies. This really, is a good insurance policy against losing your data. Although, be aware, the first save doesn't happen until you actually save it the first time, right? So you need to save it, then from that point on, it's saving it to the whatever folder you saved it to every 5 minutes, and so it's easy to go back and hopefully not lose more than 5 minutes worth of work. The other thing to be aware of is pretty much at the end of every work session, right? So I sit down and I work for however long I can, usually like an hour and a half, or given my situation. And at the end of a work session, we want to do this: save incremental. What does this do? It creates a new version of the file. This is called versioning. What is versioning? It's not putting all the eggs in one basket. If we just keep it in Control S, that's good. We're saving. Good. However, when we save, just hit Control S, it just saves over top of this file, right? So when I hit Control S, cube gets updated. If I move this, if I move one cube over, this one, right, and I Control S, I've updated the cube file with this one displaced cube over here. The problem with this is that if cube gets corrupted, which happens, then that's bad. Sometimes you can recover corrupt files, not often. And then, like you were saving, but you kind of got to start over because you've lost everything. How do we combat this with versioning, right? And so at the end of a work session, I'll come here and I'll say save incremental. And so now it saved the project but appended the 0001 afterwards, right? And so now essentially, if I look in the folder where I'm saving this, which is here, I have cube and then cube1, right? And now, you know, if the unthinkable happens and cube1 gets corrupted, I can hopefully go back to cube and have some of my work there, right? Hopefully cube was not corrupted. Just whatever happened, whatever I did while I was creating cube1 was the problem. And so then, you know, I do lose some work, but I don't lose all my work, right? And so my strategy here for what we'll call data stewardship, which means taking care of your data, right? This is an important part of the job, because if you do a bunch of great work, you know, great, but if you can't manage it, find it, or properly save it, you know, who cares? No one's going to be, you're not going to be able to contribute or work with anything. So my recommended data stewardship strategy here is 1, turning on autosave. That's going to be a good insurance policy in many situations. And then number 2, at the end of a work session, coming in and doing the save incremental, so that you have a different version of the file. And whenever I'm working, you know, I'm putting these things in a separate folder, and then you know, I organize it either according to name, or I usually organize my folders according to date modified. So the most recent thing is always just at the top, right? And you can have it's just numbering them. If I did it again here, if I go to save incremental, you'll see that now I'll have 3 files, right? And so it made 2. So it's easy to keep track of which one's which. Cool, we're doing good. Let's, the Maxon orientation I'll have you watch definitely covers some of the same things I'm covering now, but it'll be good practice to internalize a lot of this information. Pretty much everything I said today, you're going to want to memorize and internalize, because, you know, just sort of the basic operations for the program. But in that tutorial, they sort of walk through some of the basic objects and build like a fun looking robot. Let's do something a little bit different here. This is a good way to divide, you know, what am I making? Is it, a lot of times this will be the first decision to make. Obviously, you know, this is a large, complicated program, and there are different strategies for 3D modeling, right? How there's different ways that you can create different shapes. And one of the first questions as you're trying to decide on a strategy is this more of a, you know, mechanical looking object where it has right angles and kind of very well organized and subdivided appearance, or is it more of an organic looking object like a rock, a tree, something that looks like it was not precisely machined, you know, more, probably has more curves on it, right? This is a very top level sort of part of the decision making. So you'll go through the other one and you'll make something that looks a little bit more precise using this robot. Let's make something that looks a little bit more organic here. And so in this instance, there's many objects here. One of the objects I teach right away now that I think is super useful is right here. So the one that looks like the Qbert board, you know, from that video game Qbert. You guys have seen that one? This is the volume builder and volume measure. These two objects allow you to start treating the primitives. The primitives seem like very hard, unmanipulatable objects. I mean, I went in there and manipulated some of the geometry, but it was pretty angular. The volume builder and volume mesher allow you to start treating primitives like, Play-Doh or clay, where now I can take these primitive building blocks and mush them together, right, in a much more organic way. So to do this, I'm going to click and hold over here and grab both of the objects that I just talked about. The volume builder, I'll select that and let go, and then I'll grab the volume mesher, and I'll select that and let go. Now, these two objects work together, and we'll almost always use them together. And the hierarchy you need to memorize is that the volume mesher is at the top, and the volume builder is a child of it. And then beneath the volume builder, we're going to have the primitives that we want to mush, right? Things get mushed together. And so I'll take the builder and make it a child of the mesher, just like we had talked about. I'm going to go ahead and delete my cube thing just to keep it clean. Cool. That's great. All right. And so now, I have a cube. That's great. And I have a sphere. And do that. Cool. And that's great, but what if I wanted to start bringing these objects together into more of like what looked like a continuous form? Not, it looks like this is sitting on this, but they're clearly two separate objects, right? The mesh surface is not combined in any way. How can we mush them together? It's like I said before, we make it a child of the builder. And so if I grab both of these and drag them underneath the builder object, we mush together these shapes into one continuous mesh. However, they are both still able to be manipulated separately, right? So I can grab one and do any of the tools I want to manipulate it, move, scale, or rotate in order to manipulate this object. And now I have, you can clearly see how it's mushed this together. There's many, many, many parameters here, but most of the action for what we're going to use here is going to be in the volume builder, in the object tab, and if we select that, we get this window right here, which is incredibly important. This is all of the objects that are being mushed together. In addition to the objects, we can also apply filters, which is pretty interesting. The filter most often used is right here. What if we wanted to, this is fine, what if I wanted to smooth this out? If I apply the smooth, now you see that it is, smoothed out the juncture of these things. However, they are still all individual objects in a hierarchy. So they can be still manipulated individually. And the whole thing recomputes up the chain, right? And so now you can see how this is like a much more organic, Play-like, Play-Doh-like sort of situation here, where things can be mushed together like this in order to form other kinds of shapes, right? I could hit C on the sphere, and now, maybe start to flatten it, right? And maybe bring this down. Let's do this. we'll manipulate the way this cone is facing. There we go. I'll grab another sphere. I'll just control drag it. E, control drag, C, right? I'm hitting C so that when I grab it, it allows me to smush it this way. And then I can E, control drag over here, and then control drag this way. You see where I'm going here, right? But getting this sort of like mouse head shape, but everything is clearly still individual individual shapes. They're not, connected in any way. This is key for manipulating primitives. If I hit T for scale and I start doing this, you're like, why is it going in all three directions instead of just that one direction? I need to select it and hit C, and now I can smush it in the different directions, right? So you need. I'm trying to make some other unnamed, uncopyrighted mouse of some kind. We'll call him Manny Mouse. And now, these are all the individual shapes. If I want to grab all of them and make them a child of the builder, boom. Now it makes them all into one continuous Manny Mouse head shape. If I go to the builder, the filters work just like Photoshop filters, where they manipulate the things below them in the stack, right? So you can think of this stack here as Photoshop, but 3D, right? And so if you put a blur in on an adjustment layer in Photoshop, it only blurs the layers that are below that, because you're stacking things on top of each other. This is a similar situation here. And so right now nothing is being smoothed because there's nothing below the smooth. If I grab the smooth and drag it up to the top, now the whole thing has been smooth. Perhaps a bit too much. If I select the smooth, there's a handy little parameter here for strength. How smoothed do I need to smooth this, right? So I can have no smoothing or some smoothing. And in addition to this, we can add to the shape, but we can also subtract from the shape. So for instance, I'm going to move this over here, kind of like that. And then let's start, labeling things. Let's be an adult and label things. So this is ear, this is ear, this is head, this is snout. There we go. Right, so you know what's going on. And then this is going to become inner ear. And so I'm going to make this a child of that ear. You can have sub ones here, and now it just looks like Manny has developed an unfortunate tumor in his right ear, or left ear, right ear. But if we come back into the volume builder here, actually I'm not going to make it a child because it won't show up. I'm going to move it below here. In the volume builder here, just like in Photoshop, you can make layers additive or subtractive, right? And so instead of union, I'm going to go to subtract, and now it cuts that out, right, from there. So this, I think, is like a fairly clear way to manipulate things. And again, it's a separate object here, so it makes it easy to go in, and adjust this, so that if I hit C and T, and there we go, kind of like that. There we go. And if I grab this one and control drag it over this way, there we go, it gives me another one. I'll drag it up here, and then go to volume builder, and once again change this one also to subtract. And so that gives me more of a and bring those down to here. They probably, once you mush things together here, you may need to maybe adjust the shape a bit depending on, you know, what you want. Cool. All right, so this whole technique here, what I'm demonstrating, this is called volume modeling. Each three-dimensional object is being turned into not a polygon shape, but rather a volume. You can see this if you disable the mesher. This is a three-dimensional volume. The volume is different than a polygon in that it's a world of voxels, just little boxes that exist in space, right? This is Minecraft, right? The whole game is made up of, you know, like there, the voxels are the main part of the entire game. And so, you know, you can think of a voxel as like a three-dimensional pixel, right? Kind of. And so if this is what it looks like, you know, this is not something that I can manipulate. The mesher object is then taking this definition of a volume and sort of creating a mesh around the outside of it, right? That's something that we can use and that we can manipulate and that we can send to another program. One of the main things about the builder is this, okay? Now allow me to cause some alarm. Okay, alert. This parameter here can be dangerous. The voxel size, right? If we turn it down, we will get more detail, but we don't want to turn it down too far because then it will take a long time to process, right? Because we have some sort of space. If we are dividing that space into voxels, the size of the voxel as it gets smaller means that there's more voxels within the space. So you want to manipulate this box here by just pressing the up and down button. You don't want to click and drag here because that can inadvertently make it very small and the whole thing will jam up. And so if I just watch the voxels here, if I just click, right, as I move this down, you see that the definition of the shape becomes sharper because the voxels that we're using to define the volume get smaller. And if I were to convert it then, you see that in general it's better. Again, my smooth has been shifted down. I think I want to move the smooth the whole way back up to the top so that it is smoother. The other thing you may notice is that the spheres don't look very perfectly round. So any of the spheres that I have here, if I control click all of them, I'm going to turn up the segments to make them more round. That's good. Now, good. So you can see how this is a super, I think, relatively easy to understand but powerful way to create shapes, especially when you're just getting into this, right? There's obviously lots of other ways to go about manipulating shapes in the program, but I think this one translates really well to people just picking it up for the first time and makes a lot of sense, right? We've got some sort of space, we add things together to mush them, we subtract things to, you know, cut out different parts of the shape. I think it makes a lot of sense. The thing that may not look that great here is the thing that matters, the topology. What's one of the things that makes for good topology is that it's relatively even. Like it's a relatively evenly spaced grid across the surface of the object. You can see that this is not really that, right? If you look closely, they are all quads, but they're not perfect squares. They just happen to have 4 sides, and it's not particularly evenly spaced. And so we have one more object that can really help us here. And if we click on this menu, the top, click and hold, I'm going to select the remesh object. And the remesh object, we're going to put at the very top of our hierarchy, right? And so these green objects, again, these are generators. You know, the volume builder is generating a volume based on these shapes. The mesher is generating a mesh based on the volume. And then the remesh is going to re-topologize the object automatically. And so I can take the mesher, click and hold, and drag it into the remesh. And now it allows me to draw your attention down here. This is the bar. You know, as you learn more things in C4D, it may take a little while to calculate some of them. And so C4D now tries to give you some feedback down here, saying like, hey, I'm working on this. There's a bar down here. It'll say like remesh processing. And then, boom. Right? Not perfect, but this is way better than what we had before, right? You know, regardless of, you know, not knowing all the specific ins and outs of topology, this just should look more pleasing, right? It certainly looks more organized, right? We have what looks like a relatively organized grid of quads. The quads themselves are about the same shape. And another first principle. We want in almost all instances, you want the topology to follow the shape. That usually makes your life much, much easier. If the grid of how the polygons are laid out across the surface actually is informed by the shape of the object, which now it is, right? Look at this. We have, you know, like these polygons forming a circle around the circular ears. This is great. That's really good. What we had previously was this, right? Where there is certainly not some sort of clear flow around this shape, right? They are, I guess, relatively about the same size, but they do not really reflect the actual shape that we're creating, right? Because this is sort of the first level of creating a mesh from the volume, right? Because all of this is coming from voxels, right? And voxels are squares, right? We don't have, just like pixels are squares, right? You don't have non-square pixels. Every pixel on the screen is square, right? You can't have other shapes. And so we, you know, turn everything into, here's what it looks like, right? There's all of our primitives that I laid out, right? And it's like, okay, yeah, I guess that's a mouse. But there's converting it into a volume. We're able to do those subtractive processes. Again, the subtractive processes were a matter of switching the blend mode for those two objects. Now, just like actual subtraction, order matters here, right? We need to have the subtraction above the unions down there. And I've got the filter at the very top that is smoothing the whole thing out. And remember, the filter has this parameter I can use to smooth more or less. And then the mesher is forming that into some kind of mesh. And then the remesh is re-topologizing. That's the one that takes the most juice computationally wise. And now I've got a mesh. And if I want to bring this mouse head into Unity, that's like the top one. This is Manny Mouse. And file, export selected file as FBX. No cameras, no lights. Okay. Okay. Over here, grab that object, bring that right in. What do you guys think? Does it make sense conceptually? Right? It's going to take a while to get all the button clicking down, but conceptually this isn't super complicated, I don't think. And again, this type of workflow is, there'll be different types of modeling. What I'm detailing right now is called volume modeling, right? What you'll do along with the other tutorial is slightly different. You'll be combining objects, essentially using primitives, we'll call primitive modeling, without the volume builder, because you're making a robot, right? This kind of manipulation doesn't make sense for a stereotypical robot, right? We're not talking about some sort of like T1000 oozy goozy robot. We're talking about like robot. Cool. All right, so this is going to be the other assignment, is that you got to bring in the robot from the other tutorial, and I'll have you guys make either a mouse head or something very similar and bring that into Unity, along with finalizing your game based on the feedback from Monday, publishing it, and then playtesting. So a lot to do, but we don't have class on Monday. We're off because it's President's Day. And so I'm going to move the due dates on these from Sunday night to Tuesday night, right? And so we'll look at all this stuff a week from today on Wednesday, right? Do I have these dates right? Let me just look at the calendar. Yeah, Monday's the 20th. We're off on the 20th, so we won't see each other again. And there won't be a live stream on the 20th. Like I'm off. I'm not working, right? So 20th we're not having class. You can think of the other tutorial to watch as your class, and then on the 22nd we'll have everybody's game in a functional form plus your introduction to the creation of 3D models. Sound good? Okay, let's call it then. I feel good.